Hello and welcome everybody back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. Our guests this week are frequent guests in our studio, and we're always delighted to have Bill Ramsay and Isobel Lindsay. Now, when we set this appointment up with them, we had in mind that we'd be talking about something completely different, didn't we, Marlene?
Yes, that's right. We were going to be talking about the economy and how it's affected or not affected by inequality and everything. Bill sent us some background reading and we read it, and I thought, well, that'll be good stuff. And then come the day we were recording, it just seemed there's so much to talk about coming out from this tsunami of actions from the White House, and then the effect of that on Ukraine and Europe and the UK. And it was obvious that Isobel and Bill, wanted to talk about that. And although they're not disconnected completely, they're not the kind of things we could do in one podcast. So we've gone for talking about the kind of instability that there is, as a result of Trump being elected, how he's acting, and then that horrible time in the White House with the way that they treated Zelensky.
We will come back to the other topic because it was really interesting. It definitely worth another episode. Yeah. But this one, this was more immediately topical. And there was a phrase that Bill used during the conversation, which to me just sums it up. This is like just putting Post-its on the wall of the things you've got to unpack. And it kind of feels a bit like that. There's just so much happening.
Yeah, and you kind of think that, it's this, and then that'll happen, and then something else comes in, or from off stage, suddenly it's centre stage. So hence the title, Events, Dear Boy.
Events, Dear Boy.
Events.
There are some things that have happened that surely warrant discussion. One, the new Chancellor-elect of Germany said 2 days ago, or was it 3, that Europe has to consider something other than NATO. That is to say, having an organisation that has a nuclear umbrella provided by Britain and France. Now that's the man who's almost certainly, Wertz's name is, I think he is going to be the new German Chancellor. Then you've got at the United Nations a series of votes in Ukraine. The first bit is that the Russians and the Americans voted the same way. But China, which is supposedly a peer competitor or something like that, abstained. So you've got Russia and the United States taking a position on Ukraine, their position, and you've got others who are taking a supportive position, and then you've got ones in between taking an unaligned position, including China. So you've got America and Russia voting one way and China voting the other way. Then you've got the Prime Minister talking about boots on the ground, and that's remarkable because at least he's been carefully saying only with American air cover effectively, so that means it won't happen. And then you've got the conference that took place in London Saturday, was it? In which you had the coalition of the willing. And then, of course, you get the whole bust up in the White House. So where to start and what does it mean?
One of the ways to understand what's happening is that the US's big concern is China. And the reason for that is not because of China's military dominance, and China actually hasn't got very many bases in any other countries, nor has it prioritized military action. It has prioritized economic action. The Belt and Road thing of giving countries throughout Africa, Asia, giving them investment in constructive projects, in return, of course, for the fact that they will do business with China. China will be the key person for them. This is the big concern for the US. And I think it has been suggested, and there's certainly some reasonably plausible, that one of the things that the US wants to do, certainly in the Trump camp, it is to separate Russia from China. So it doesn't mind what happens vis-a-vis Russia if it can bring itself into a greater alliance with Russia and separate from China. Now, I don't think this will work for all kinds of reasons, but I think that's a bit of the rationale. But one of the things that concerned me more, which I thought was pretty outrageous in relation to the European NATO states, I exclude Turkey from this, is that yesterday, the last few days are about the only time they have started talking about taking initiatives to try to end the Ukraine war, to negotiate, to do the things which so often happen to wars. They end in a messy way, but eventually they have to end with negotiations. Now, Turkey did try hard, and there were Istanbul negotiations in April 22, that there were agreements actually written out and negotiated there. But then along came some of the Europeans at that point, particularly the British PM, with, brave boys, we'll stand behind you, etc., etc. Don't concede anything. And the trouble is, no initiatives were being taken. It's been a downward path for Ukraine. And whether you like it or not, the idea of just going on with more and more and more deaths.
Could I just ask why you say it's a downward path? Because, I mean, it's certainly an awful situation they're in, and obviously they're losing people. If you compare that with the downward path that Russia's on, though, I mean, they've lost it's over 800,000 now, men either killed or out of action. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a horrible situation for both, but it could well be that, with the number of military that Russia's lost, plus the effect that that's having on their economy, because now it's a war economy, but they've lost all these guys who are now not working in normal jobs, so they're not available just to keep the Russian economy going. So but there's a lot of sliding around there, whereas Ukraine, I'm not saying it isn't sliding down a bit, but it's also being backed up by European countries who are coming in with help to keep the electricity supplies going, as well as things like, armaments.
Can I say here, first of all, don't take the figures for troop losses from either side as the truth. They've been huge on both sides. But the actual numbers, countries tend not to give you the accurate figures in a lot of this. But they have, of course, Russia has made huge losses, but it's a bigger country with a much bigger population. And its economy, surprisingly, has stood up reasonably well.
So much of the information we're getting on both sides is invested. Our media, understandably, are invested supporting the Ukrainians, so you don't hear the other side. The Russian media invested in the Russian. But the Royal United Services Institute, the world's oldest military think tank, I happen to be a member, just a fee-paying retired member, produced an economic paper a week ago and pointed out that the Russian economy is actually growing. You'll not hear much about it, but it's growing. And the reason for that is very simple. It's growing for the same reasons that the economy of the USA upticked from 1941 and the economy of the UK upticked from 1942. It's basically Keynesian economics. There are two problems with that. One is deaths and maiming of young men in the main, and destruction. The United States created the middle class of the United States out of World War II. They had to give black men proper jobs and decent salaries. They employed women in decent salaries as well. And so the United States economic miracle, if you can call it that, occurred from 1941-42 when they rearmed. And also, there was very little and virtually no kinetic damage in the United States. There was no widespread damage to the American infrastructure. In Russia, there's very little damage to the infrastructure. Okay, there's the odd long-range Ukrainian drone hitting various refineries and such, but there's not much. And this is not me, this is the Royal United Services Institute, that the Russian economy is growing, that the GDP is up, for very simple reasons. They're needing more employment in the war economy. War economies tend to cause an uptick in economic activity. The downside usually is industrial level deaths and industrial level destruction. If you don't have the deaths or you don't care, And if you don't have the destruction, and that's not really happening, then the economy actually grows.
I can kind of get my head around why those kind of shifts happen. At the same time, the Russian economy, before all this got going, I mean, the Russian economy is not a hugely successful economy these days, is it? I mean, the GDP per head of the Russian population is really low compared to OECD countries.
Marlene, we had a very interesting webinar just last Monday, and one of the people on that who's been working in Ukraine, he's not Ukrainian, he's Canadian citizen, but he works for an international humanitarian organization. He's an economist, and his job is to try to assess what kind of humanitarian damage is being done in war zones and disaster zones. And even I was quite surprised by the series of stats that he put up, that before the war, Ukraine was amongst the poorest per capita countries in Europe. It was losing lots of population from out-migration. And of course, as we know in Scotland, so much of that loss of population, it's the young and the more educated who were getting better jobs elsewhere. And of course, there were lots. Zelensky, actually, his election and so on, did stabilise things a bit, but before then, there'd been a lot of instability and corruption in Ukraine. Now, the problem is that the war has resulted in a population loss of about 8 million. That's the formal figure, because of refugees, with people leaving, young people leaving because they didn't want to be drafted. But you've had this big loss of population, and again, most of it has been the younger population. So it is starting with a country, and this is another thing that really has angered me about some of the Western commentary. They've kept on about, we need more defence expenditure, more defence expenditure. None of them has been saying what we need is a major reconstruction fund for Ukraine when the war ends, because sometime or other it's got to end. Ukraine was not in a good way at all beforehand. It's in an even worse way now, with its population problems, with the extent of the poverty, with the extent of the damage that's been done by the war. So it's not in a strong position. Biden did ask one of the US senior military figures at the end of 22 to do a report on where the war was going. And his conclusions in that report was Ukraine has done quite well in stemming some of the initial advances. It's done quite well. But he said at this point, his estimate was that was peak achievement. And that after that, everything was on its way down. What he was recommending to Biden, this is the time where Russia is weaker, Ukraine's looking a bit better, to push for a settlement. And Biden just slapped him down.
So that was Mark Milley, who was the senior uniformed person in the United States. It was in the autumn of 2022. Mark Milley turned around and said, the Ukrainians have retaken Kharkiv, Russia's in the back foot, settle now. Now, what happened was he was slapped down for saying that. The squad, the left of the American Congress, as they're known, Ocasio-Cortez et al., echoed him, and they were told to shut up as well. And, then you had apparently negotiations in Turkey that were going somewhere, and then they were vetoed for some reason. And the point about the economy, I've managed to pull up the Ramsay article. The headline says the following. This was by Dr. Richard Conley in the 22nd of January. And this is Ramsay, Russia's wartime economy isn't as weak as it looks. And the first sentence says, Russia's economic resilience is defying expectations, enabling the Kremlin to sustain its war efforts in Ukraine despite mounting challenges and raising doubts about hopes of a swift resolution. That's not Russian website. That's the oldest military think tank in the world. The premier word in Britain. These are not, pro-Russian people.
Fair enough, but that's not the sign of a sustainable, strong economy.
There's a terrible mistake that is made. It's understandable, and it's a kind of shorthand when people talk about Europe. 40% of European land territory is Russia. Russia is a European power. You might not like it. There are very good reasons for not liking it, but we do share a continent. It's not the old Soviet Union was divided between Europe and Asia, but Russia isn't. And we have to remember that it is a massive country geographically, and it has a lot of resources there. So yes, it's not per capita prosperous country, but it's not the poorest, and it has a lot of resources. And ironically, one of the reasons, it's a secondary reason, but one of the reasons why the Russian economy has been doing better than was thought is because a lot of companies left, and it was Russian companies that filled the gap.
They bought them cheaply, the same way that they did when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean,
yes.
I mean, that's true. And of course, you're right. You just have to walk around a city like St. Petersburg. It's a European capital. You look at the architecture and the layout and everything. It's just like a load of other big, beautiful European capitals. So, I mean, that's true. But at the same time, Russia's ruled by a pretty barbaric dictator now, backed up by oligarchs. I mean, maybe not, maybe to the same extent that he was before he launched his 3-day, victory march into Kyiv. But it's not European in that sort of sense. I mean, it is European culturally, even maybe still.
It doesn't matter. I mean, its economy. A lot of the exports are now going to India.
Yeah.
The oil is going to India, going into third ghost companies and ending up back in Europe. That's happening to some extent. So a lot of the slack on the energy market has been picked up by India, by China, by various others. And there are issues over Russia's relationship with China as something is subservient. I mean, there's no two ways about it. The Russians will have to watch themselves, or China will gobble them up. But in a sense, it's not that the Russian economy is doing brilliantly. It's simply it's not doing particularly badly. It's not that much. It's not a decisive issue. Let's put it that way. The economic stuff is not a factor that's going to cause Putin to settle. And at the end of the day, what happens after the war we'll have to see what happens. Because remember, our economy upticked from 42. Our economy upticked, and after it, the British economy grew until 1979. The American economy upticked from 41 and grew and continues to grow. It's just that the American working class, their buying power hasn't changed since 1976. But that's a separate issue.
We do need to remember too, not just the awful Russian oligarchs, but the bloody awful and more powerful US oligarchs.
Oh, absolutely.
And, that is such an enormous concern. But I'd like to get back to what the implications are for us, because we're in a situation where the UK, for decades, in order to try to sustain the phony image of being a global power, imperial splendor, etc., what it did was just to cozy up to the US and give the US whatever the US wanted. And in return, Trump, this afternoon, tomorrow, he could sit and sign one of his edicts in the Oval Office, which said the US will no longer lease Trident missiles to the UK.
Yeah.
Just like that. Because the UK has been totally dependent, and this goes back to the 60s, has been totally dependent on the US for its nuclear capacity. It can build the warheads, always to a US design now. It can build the subs to a US design, but it can't deliver anything.
Is that not also the case with the anti-aircraft missiles that the Ukrainians are using? Because it's American technology, was my understanding. And if they take that away, it leaves, okay, you've got the rest of Europe saying, oh, suddenly we've got to do something. And it does seem to have injected some urgency that doesn't appear to have been there before.
Yeah, I mean, the key actually is in terms of the Americans are not, I mean, the Americans are not going to sell or give over, operate, for tactical and operational reasons, armaments that are duds. That's not going to happen. So the missiles will be fine. That's not the issue. Any material we get from the United States will be fine. It's not that. It's about Britain. And it's about there's discussion now about a post-NATO Europe. And there was a point about the new German Chancellor, the man who's likely to be, and what he said, talking about a Franco-British nuclear umbrella. But look at Trump's Isobel was saying, look at Trump's transactional attitude. You do what I want. If you don't, then we're going to slap tax off you. You could take the missiles from the British. You could bang up the price of the rental from for the missiles from British. You could do all sorts of things with those missiles, because if they don't have them, they can't do it. Now, here's the point. The French and the Germans are starting to think that NATO's out the window. And if that's the case, the French and the Germans' basic geopolitical determinant of France and Germany is simple. To hold each other close so that they don't end up in a war like they did in 1870, 1914, 1939. That's the basic determinant of German and French foreign policy. That point. And if America goes, the first thing the French and Germans will do, and they're already talking about it, is for a new alliance to be formed around about France and Germany, and they're talking about the British bomb as well as the French bomb. There is no British bomb. So at the end of the day, if they do form an alliance, Britain may be in, may be out. They're not going to rely on a missile. At the end of the day, the President of the United States has got a veto on. And it's things like this. I mean, I don't know the answers to these, but these are being thrown up because of Trump.
Going back to the Franco-German, that sort of alliance, I mean, if we've got the submarines, we can make the warheads. If it came down to it, surely we could make our own missiles.
Well,
in alliance with the French and the Germans.
The problem for that is that it would cost a fortune. So it's not just the increases in defence expenditure they're talking about. It's not just the cuts to the aid budget they're talking about. And by the way, Lord Dannett, who was the head of the British Army a few years ago, was in The Guardian on Saturday saying the cuts to the aid budget is nuts. Mm-hmm. He quoted a former, another American chair of the Joint Chiefs, who, when, I don't know who it was, but president, maybe Trump in his first term, was talking about cutting the budget of the State Department. The head of the Joint Chiefs at the time said, well, if you're going to cut the budget of the State Department, you'll have to give me more ammunition. Because that was American soft power, supposedly. It's not just about Britain's going to increase its defence expenditure, and I'm not clear, I think that's going to be an issue. As a trade unionist, there are interesting questions there. It's because Britain is so out of kilter with Europe that Britain would have to reconfigure what it does. The Germans have got a big army compared to Britain. So is the French. So is various European countries. The Turkish army is huge. They've got all of that, but it's on a landmass. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The British army is small, but that's not really an issue either. It's just that they've got 2 aircraft carriers. What's that got to do with defending against the Russians? Assuming the Russians are coming, which they ain't, because they couldn't if they wanted to. But even if you were to take the argument, let's assume that the argument is that Putin wants to take over Ukraine or wants to take over some of the Baltic countries.
Yeah, Lithuania or Moldova.
But I think we could agree that the Russians have lost tens of thousands of men and they've not moved very far from their own border. If that's the case, how is it that if the Russians can't beat the Ukrainians relatively straightforwardly with relatively light casualties, suddenly they're going to invade Western Europe? But let's even accept that argument. It would take the Russians 5-10 years to reach this mythical stage, which I don't think will happen or will get there. But it would take 5 or 10 years. So what's the rush? What's the rush in increasing the defence budget at the moment? And the rush is very simple. The military-industrial complex can't believe their luck. They can't believe that politicians are talking about increases to defence budgets. And there's another advantage. Trump's a businessman, and here's a good one for the American businessman. If America pulls out, the European budgets are going up. They've got to buy new aircraft. Where are they going to buy them? The USA. Okay, they can buy them from Europe, but they'll do what the silly Norwegians did. The Norwegians have got an oil fund. The Norwegians could have done a deal with the Swedes, who've got their own defence industry. They could have done a deal for a new aircraft. The Swedes have developed one. The Norwegians and the Swedes could have done a deal. After all, they're next to each other. It would have been good for their own industries. But not the Norwegian politicians. They go and they buy aircraft from McDonnell Douglas, 100 million a pop. The big stooshy that occurred in the Oval Office, there was someone showing the share prices of the American and the European arms companies. Their share prices before the televised debate was like that. The share prices after the televised debate, immediately after the debate.
And it's gone up even more today, all the arms companies. We are being sold a phony scenario. It's being exaggerated that we're going to be invaded and that all Europe is, and it is nonsense. There are very specific reasons for the Ukraine situation. And it's a long story, but a lot of history. And probably if Ukraine, and this incidentally was George Robertson's view, the former NATO Secretary General and of our parish, that it was a huge mistake for NATO to say, and this is the number one crunch for Russia, for NATO to have said in 2008, in principle, Georgia and Ukraine can join NATO a wee bit down the line. In principle, we accept that. Now, that was like saying to America, well, do you mind having Russian bases in Canada or Mexico or Panama? And of course, some of us remember the Cuban crisis. So because the Americans actually, according to Robertson, they were trying to build up positive relationships in the 90s, right up to about 2002. They had a NATO-Russian council. And America at that time said, this stops. We don't want this to go ahead. And we have, the old Eisenhower quote, which has been off-quoted, but is so true. When he retired, he said, I have to warn you about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. And we are seeing that today because they are desperate to make money or to increase the strength of their organizations, and therefore they are spinning these stories, you're about to be invaded. And remember that despite the fact that Russia was given the assurances after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union that NATO wouldn't move eastward, and then as soon as that, it did move
true.
eastward.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I remember not long ago, I saw a map of what NATO looked like some years back. So it was probably 15, 20 years back. And if you look at that compared with the NATO countries now, I mean, from a Russian point of view, you can understand they're going, hey, wait, look, you're really encroaching on us. And then you add Georgia in or Ukraine as well. I mean, you can understand that. But I suppose the thing is, we are where we are.
Indeed.
Yes.
I've managed to find, because when all of this sad, tragic story started back in 2022, and it doesn't have a date on it, but this was an interview by the Times Radio, okay? Now, the Times Radio is hardly pro-Russian, and they're interviewing Lord Robertson. Here's the title of the 15-minute video they did with him. Should NATO have held Putin closer? In other words, what Isobel is just saying, in other words, should they have kept a closer relationship with Russia instead of pushing them away? That was George Robertson a few weeks after the invasion started. He's changed his tune a bit since then. I think your point about the arms industry, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. the arms industry, Rheinmetall and French industries, the share prices went up, but the share prices went up in the American ones as well. And so there'll be questions about that. And that's, I mean, in a sense, we're only, and all we can do in this conversation is literally sort of stick in the wall the post-its of the issues that need to be unpacked over a period of time. What do they do? I mean, at the moment, as a trade unionist, I'm thinking cuts to public services. Okay, now he's taking it from the aid budget, which is pretty reprehensible, and as Lord Dannett said, dumb geopolitically, like what the former chair of the Joint Chiefs said about cutting to the State Department budgets. But the point about it is, at the moment, there's a bit of analysis, not much being done in, okay, minus the USA, what does NATO have? What does NATO have? They call it a sort of order of battle. The lineups of planes, ships, missiles, tanks, soldiers, armoured personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery, ordinary artillery, all of that stuff. The order of battle of the equipment and trained soldiers and reservists. And when you take the United States out of the frame, NATO is much stronger than the Russians are at the moment. And the second point to take into account, they're talking about the Russians attacking. Since World War I and before, since the modern age really, since industrial warfare in the late 19th century, everybody has accepted if someone's attacking, they've got to outnumber the other side at least 3-1. Well, NATO currently in certain areas outnumbers the Russians 2-1, 3-1, 10-1. There's some areas where the Russians do outnumber the West. If you take the 6,000 nuclear warheads compared to 300, that's a point. But if you're trying to take over Western Europe or a bit of the Lithuania or something like that, a nuclear weapon, and I'm against nuclear weapons, but what we can say is if you're going to try and invade somewhere to take it into your orbit, you don't want to fire nuclear missiles into it. So I think we can take the Russian nuclear weapons out of the frame if they are a threat to invasion. They don't have the ability to do it compared to what the West has got, which brings me back to the point, why do we need to build it up? Just got one example. Finland, the great wise Putin, the great strategic leader, what's he managed to achieve? Finland and Sweden were neutral. They're now in NATO. Take Finland. Finland has been non-aligned for many years, and it designed its armed forces purely to see off a Russian attack if it came. The way that Finland works is they have conscription, and men and women go into the army, and then they get retrained for the next 4 or 5 years at various levels. After a mobilization period of 6 weeks, the Finns would have 230,000 men and women in uniform. 230,000. The Swedes don't have that, but they've got big arms industry and modern equipment. They've joined NATO since this thing has started. So if Putin is some sort of Napoleon, he's not a very good one.
Not often that I agree with a former Tory minister, but Philip Oppenheim made a statement at the weekend. He was a minister in Thatcher's government, and he said, we don't need increased defence expenditure. He said, we need smarter expenditure. And he said, Ministry of Defence, the defence establishment in the UK has been totally incompetent. And the amount of money that has been spent, I mean, the aircraft carrier is one example, but in so many ways, they have been taken, whether a lot of corruption, there's one company that's being investigated just now for corruption, but certainly the aircraft carrier ended up costing 50% more than it was supposed to. And that covers so much of all their equipment and their management. And so the thing here is that we should be thinking, I mean, his view was, yes, the focus should be on cyber security, it should be on drones, etc. And it's quite true. So much of the old thinking about defence is completely out of date. Things have changed so rapidly. And looking at Scotland, the first thing I think in our debate that we should be talking about is, I think I'd be tempted to say we ban the word defence. And for a year or two, we're only allowed to use the word security, which makes us think of the wider concept. Now, the risks, the practical risks that we have in Scotland, one, obviously, we have this large nuclear base on our coastline. But in addition to that is because we have such important resources around our coast. Now, it's not just the huge energy resources or fishing, transport, etc., but it's also the fact that, and you know, so many people don't realise that I only came across the map rather by accident of the undersea cables that come in round the coast of Scotland, which so many of our infrastructure is totally dependent, and how readily a lot of that might be attacked. And really, if you want to undermine a country now, then, you know, go for your cyber systems, because do a really effective job there, then it doesn't take long to see collapse all over the place. We need to rethink that.
Thinking about the undersea cables, because that's what Russia has been doing in the Baltic. You know, all you need is a ship that just lets its anchor out and it runs along the bottom of the sea. And I mean, they've been doing that. I mean, Sweden and Finland, they're now looking out for it, aren't they? So it's a new sort of threat, isn't it? Yes. And then the other thing is, you know, it's easy to find, you know, tank after tank after tank being demolished with a little drone that's got some sort of bomb in it, and the tank disappears. Yeah. It's a much point in building that kind of armament.
Yeah. But you'll get a lot of think tanks that would that are paid for. They get projects from the military-industrial complex. You know, you'll get a young student. They'll get funded by an arms company to do a PhD. They're not going to come up with that. They're going to come up with a challenge, and the challenge, the solution, funnily enough, will be something that the company can make, as opposed to facing up to the realities. And if you see, I mean, the Ukraine war, it's horrible. It's nasty, but it's very, 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 very slow because of the modern technology of drones and things like that. The United States are a bit different if they get involved, because they'll get so much overwhelming force they could put in. So this doesn't apply to the States. But to virtually anyone else, trying to attack in the modern age would be such a nightmare. And therefore, the question of what's the threat? And the threats aren't the Russians. You know, the Russians are coming and they're sending tanks in and all the rest of it. It's other things. And another good example, if I may put it, they talk about China and how China's a threat. I had lunch recently up near the Edinburgh University, and had dinner recently in Byres Road, and that's near Glasgow University. And there was loads of young Chinese students, lassies. And another friend of mine said, half jokingly, our university sector relies upon polite young ladies from China coming to Scotland to do a soft degree as their end of their finishing school. I think that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but we rely a lot, our university sector relies a lot on Chinese students. So if China ever wanted to say, turn the screw of it on us, the first thing they would do isn't disrupt that or disrupt that. They would simply say to the Scottish university sector, we want you to introduce 4 semesters instead of 3 and disrupt us. And if you don't do it, we're taking our students out. You know, those are the sort of things. I think the threats are overblown. Some people will come up with a threat because they've got a solution. And by the way, it's a cunning plan or it's a new device, whether it's military, whether it's something else. And we live in an information age where there's so much rubbish on the internet that, you know, you literally don't know what to believe.
What can we do for the people in Ukraine? The most important thing in the context of so many wars, not all, but so many wars, is you find a way to stop the war. What happens to countries after wars can be quite surprising. I mean, look at the success of Vietnam today. But the important thing is to stop all the terrible, the killing, the loss of young people, the destruction. So it's going to be try and push that, and it is going to mean, yes, Ukraine saying that we'll stay non-aligned as far as NATO is concerned if NATO is still there, and they're going to lose some territory in the east, but get something agreed and then get the focus, because let's remember, the Soviet Union didn't collapse because of a military invasion. The Warsaw Pact didn't collapse because of that. It collapsed because so many of its citizens looked at other countries and thought the quality of life that was on offer was so much better, and there was the dissatisfaction with what they had. And the best you can do is get the bloody war stopped, and then enable, not just get the bloody war stopped, stop Ukraine from doing this appalling deal with the US where it's selling its rare minerals, and get it focused with a big aid package, a reconstruction package in building up the country, a bit reduced on the east, but building up the country to be an attractive place.
Yes.
It sends a message that is much more important.
One of the benefits of having your country blown to smithereens is when you rebuild it, you could rebuild it state of the art with, net zero energy sources, beautifully laid out. You really could make get everybody invested in it.
Yeah, I mean, so they lose the Donbass over in the east, and even Crimea. I mean, I know that would be tough for the Ukrainians to go along with that, but actually there's a huge historical, almost existential connection that the Russians feel with Crimea. It goes back to Catherine the Great, I think, doesn't it? I'm sure we've talked about that in previous chats. So, I mean, I can see that would be tough, but exactly what you're saying, let Russia do what they'll do in the Donbass. They probably won't put much money into making it into modern kind of regions again, but let Ukraine get on with it with Western European help.
How do you preserve that, though? Because as one of the points that Zelensky was making in the White House was that over the last, I think it was 10 years, the Russians have broken 25 ceasefire agreements and 25 peacekeeping agreements. So somebody has to be keeping the peace. We've relied on it being America and NATO, but if that's no longer the world order, then it is going to have to be something different. Yeah,
it's going to have to be Western Europe that does it. And maybe that's where Starmer's saying, French, British boots on the ground.
I'm not so sure about the troops. That's not going to, the Russians are not going to tolerate NATO countries in a peacekeeping force. And Starmer knows that. I mean, Starmer, in the same sentence earlier today, said, we'll only go if we've got American backstops. And Putin has made it. I mean, UN votes where Russia and America are voting one way, a lot of other countries are voting another, and China, I repeat, was abstaining. You're not going to get that. But I think, in a sense, the irony is, if you look at, as you were talking about, look at the end of World War II, the Americans sort of won the peace because they through the Marshall Plan, they rebuilt Germany and gave it a constitution that better than their own, that has served the purpose more or less until fairly recently, in fact until this war. And Japan, where they did the same, they rebuilt Japan and they put in a constitution. I'm not suggesting that the West interfere in the politics of Ukraine, I'm not suggesting that. But in terms of like the Marshall Plan, if it was good enough for Germany and Japan, why can't we do a Marshall Plan or something like that for Ukraine? It's not as if it's like a new idea. It's happened before, and not just before once, but before twice. And neither Japan nor Germany are seen as economic basket cases. Partly because, as you say, they rebuilt with modern equipment.
And do remember, it's difficult, it's the historians who may find this, so we don't know what the psychology was that made Putin launch this war. Obviously, they were giving aid to the rebels in the Donbass area, who were, because it's got a large ethnic Russian population, and in the case of Crimea, it's got a majority ethnic Russian population. But I think Putin genuinely believed that just as they had gone into Crimea, and in effect, from reading any of the international journalists who were there, in effect were welcomed, because Ukraine government at that time wasn't all that popular, and so many of them did regard themselves as ethnic Russian, but were welcomed. I think Putin probably genuinely thought he was going to invade, and the Ukrainian population were going to welcome the Russian saviors, that it was going to be an easy take. Mm. The psychology of some of these isolated authoritarian leaders, and some of the supposedly democratic leaders in the White House just now, but the psychology, I think, suggests that he did think this was going to be a comparatively easy take.
I find it very difficult to believe that as he was preparing to invade, his intelligence people in the Ukraine, and remember, if you had intelligence people in Ukraine, there would be an open sight, and I'm only using this as a comparator. If Scotland were independent and MI5 wanted to set up a station in Glasgow or Edinburgh, they could do it in plain sight because culturally we are so similar. What must have been the same for the Russian intelligence services. I find it amazing that they didn't realise that the Ukrainians were not going to lie down. I could be wrong here. I suspect they'd be sending Putin reports saying this is not going to work, and he delusionally just poo-pooed it.
Or he surrounded himself with yes men in exactly the same way as Trump has done.
Yeah.
He's never going to get a straight answer anywhere.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very good point. That's exactly what Trump's doing at the moment.
I was with friends today. They'd been on a cruise, and they were in their cruise, and it was down in Brazil, and there was a lot of American folk of a certain age, and they were shocked by the number of these Americans with a bit of money. So they assumed because they had a passport, they were relatively sophisticated, and they were banging on about Trump in the most glowing terms. And that must be just because of what they're hearing.
What do we think is going to happen about Trump's supposed visit here? Because on the one hand, you've got him threatening to invade or annex Canada, which has the same head of state as we're promising he's going to come over here and visit. And you've got our First Minister saying, look, I don't think you can do that. And Keir's telling him to get back in his box.
Oh, I think that's going to be fun. I mean, for instance, let's take the state dinner down in Windsor. A big long table, a hugely long table with gilt chairs and the best china and glass you could find. Now, John, as First Minister, I assume, will be invited to the state dinner along with the FM of Wales and the FM of Northern Ireland, right? But I would assume that they'll be way down the other end of the table. There's that one. And then we've got the bed and breakfast visit to Balmoral.
Yeah.
Well, Marlene's got a plan.
I've got a plan for that. So I'll just tell you what the plan is. The plan is whether it's Dumfries House or Balmoral, so we get as many Scots as possible to be on the route. I mean, I know they might have to, have double up and cover for various routes. And we're all wearing kilts.
There'll be plenty of us.
We're all wearing kilts. And when the entourage goes by, we turn round, and then you know what we do next.
Yes. I mean, Britain, because of the bomb, because of the fact that it's an American Trident, they can't offend him. Because, I assume if someone is a hubristic blowhard, disagreeing with them can be an interesting experience. But if they're a narcissist and you ridicule them, that's 10 times worse.
Yeah. Good.
So, well, that was very interesting. Not at all what we thought we were going to discuss, but events nearby, these things happen, don't they?
Yes, that's true. I'm sure it was the right thing to do to switch on to talking about this.
Thanks
okay then.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Right.
That was a really quite a wide-ranging discussion, but there's just so many tentacles in this situation. And, you know, we did get down quite a lot of different avenues about future relationships and defence spending needs and all sorts that it's impossible at this stage to know how things will pan out. But out of adversity often comes a lot of creativity, and there's a huge number of really brilliant cartoons and memes and things doing the rounds at the moment. We're on Blue Sky, as you know. Marlene's been keeping an eye out.
There's so many of the cartoons that are coming from Canada because they're having great fun. The Trump sandwich, white bread, full of bologna with Russian dressing and a small pickle. This one's from the Have I Got News For You blog, which is not quite the same as the BBC programme. After shouting, bullying and parroting Russian propaganda, Donald Trump says the whole of America has been disrespected in its cherished Oval Office. Comment, he's not wrong. He's the one who's disrespected the Oval Office. There's a long-standing tradition of cartoons being part of political protests. So please, everyone, carry on producing them. Cheer us
and
up.
Sharing them. Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.